This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Week 13 edition of the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network, brought to you by the Fan Up Network. And this is pretty much the final week of the regular season in the majority of people's fantasy football seasons. So it's the ultimate, it's the last chance for you to get in. Now, in my main league, I am out. In my family league, though, I am in a prime position. I'm in the playoff picture. No worries. And I'm hoping that I can help all of you out there who maybe you're sitting right around 500 and you got a couple people battling for that last or one of the last two playoff spots. And I'm hoping that my help here in this podcast can get you into your fantasy football playoffs. So we already had one game end up this week with the Dallas at Minnesota. It wasn't as high scoring as you thought, and I think you could have I think this is actually what you were going to expect out of really Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott, probably one of the best running backs of the year this year, going up against a tough defense in Minnesota, at home for Minnesota. So Ezekiel Elliott still performed up to standards, but he was pretty much the main story in that game on Thursday. But let's move on to the matchups in Week 13 that are really going to help you get into the fantasy playoffs this season. First up, we got the Lions at the Saints, my hometown team, and I think it's going to go one of two ways, and I think it's either going to be a high-scoring matchup for both teams, or this could be a falling-off game for the Detroit Lions. So I think the potential is there, but I'd go with a little bit of caution. I wouldn't just start every single Detroit Lion in this game. So Matthew Stafford definitely has the potential to have a big game here because the Saints aren't that great of a defense. But as we've seen in the past couple of weeks and really over this entire season, is that the Detroit Lions have been more of a conservative offense, as that they aren't really taking too many shots downfield. I'd take some caution. I think there's the possibility that he goes out and maybe he throws for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns. But I think there's also, on the same hand, the possibility that he throws for 200 yards and maybe a touchdown or two. So I think Stafford, though, is still a really good start this week because I don't think he's not gonna hurt you this week. And then the running back, Theo Riddick, I think he's always really been involved with the offense, and especially in PPR leagues, he can get you a ton of points because he's usually right up there with all the Lions players in the number of targets and the number of catches that he's getting. So Theo Riddick is a good start this week. And then all three receivers really have an interesting upside. I think Golden Tate has really shown that he's been the number one guy for the second half of the season. And I think he's going to be Matt Stafford's number one target. But then after that, Marvin Jones is probably listed as the number 2 receiver, but he hasn't been playing like the number 2 receiver. He's really been the guy. If they are going to take a shot downfield, they're going to go to Marvin Jones. But as we have seen that they aren't really taking those risks, Marvin Jones' production has dwindled a little bit. So I would actually probably have him listed as the 3rd wide receiver in the Lions this week. The guy that I'm actually really interested in, and if you have him, he could give you some decent numbers this week, is Anquan Boldin. He was really kind of an afterthought at the beginning of the season because people just figured that he's going to be a 3rd wide receiver. They aren't really going to use him a ton. But as we've seen, is Boldin has become, outside of Theo Riddick, Boldin is Matt Stafford's checkdown guy. And he's been getting a ton of receptions in the last couple weeks. So if you're in a PPR league, Anquan Boldin is a really interesting start in this game. On the other side of the ball, with the New Orleans Saints, I really think that they're going to probably shred the Lions defense. I'm not predicting a win outright for the Saints, But what we've seen is, even though the Lions have been able to string wins together in the last couple weeks, is that they still let the offense perform at a high level. You see guys like Sam Bradford and Case Keenum, we make them look like all-star quarterbacks. So I think Drew Brees, being a really good quarterback and in a really good offense that suits him, he's probably going to put up some pretty decent numbers against the Lions. So Drew Brees is an awesome start. Mark Ingram, I think if one thing, the Lions have been okay at shutting down the run, so I don't think the Saints are going to have any problem passing the ball, so they're probably going to do that a bunch. So Ingram is still a pretty decent start. I'd probably put him as a running back 2 this week. So then you go to the wide receivers, and the 3 receivers, it's almost similar to the Lions, is that they have 3 receivers who at times are the best on the field, and at times they're the worst on the field. So you got Brandon Cooks, Michael Thomas, and Willie Snead. And if I had to rank them, I think Michael Thomas is actually, even though he's not the number 1 receiver, I think he might be the best option in this game because he's the possession guy. And I think Breeze will probably dump it down to him a bunch. After that, I'd probably go Brandon Cooks just because of the talent he has, and then Willie Snead after that. But I think all of them really have potential starting this week. If you're desperate to get in and you want one of those risky players to maybe give you maybe produce well outside of their range, I think Willie Snead is a decent pick, but I'd probably put him as a flex. And I'd be careful because there's a possibility that Willie Snead gives you absolutely nothing this week. And then the Lions have always been bad against the tight end this year. So I think Kobe Fleener is even going to be in the mix in this game too. So I put him in the top 10 of tight ends this week. The next matchup I got for you is the Chiefs at the Falcons. And this is going to be an interesting matchup because both of these teams are at the tops of their division and they're going to be fighting for a playoff spot. So both of them really have incentive to get wins. So starting with the Chiefs, Alex Smith he's not a fantasy football quarterback. He's a game manager, and that's really all he is. I think at times we've seen him maybe develop and maybe have a big game here or there, but it usually just is followed up with a big fat garbage performance. So if you're going to start Alex Smith, I'd be very careful. I would not start him because the way that the Chiefs play is that they ground and pound, and then they beat you on defense. And the guy that they ground and pound you with is their running back Spencer Ware, who's been a very productive fill-in for Jamal Charles this entire year. And I think Spencer Ware is probably just going to finish out the season as the number 1 running back. And I think he's probably the best person on the Chiefs right now if you're going to start him fantasy-wise. At wide receiver, I don't trust anybody there. If I had to pick one guy who's an interesting pick, it's the rookie wide receiver Tyreek Hill. You saw him get I think he got a rushing touchdown last week on a Wildcat play. And if the Chiefs are looking to really create offense, Tyreek Hill is a dynamic type of player. So again, if you're looking for a risk play here, Tyreek Hill is a really interesting play. But if you want to go with your tried and true, I would probably start them over Tyreek Hill. And then Travis Kelce, just because the tight ends are they fluctuate so much in the league, he still is a number within the top 10 of tight ends. On the opposite side of the ball with the Atlanta Falcons, Matt Ryan is still producing at a very high level, which we haven't seen in previous seasons, and I've said it all year that you ride Ryan until he really shows that he doesn't have it anymore. And the Falcons may be having a magical season, and I think Matt Ryan, you still got to start him. I think he's a top 10 tight end still. And then Devontae Freeman, even though he isn't returning to where he was last year, I mean, he was helped out with some pretty big performances last year. He still is a really dependable running back, and you're going to start him every single week, pretty much regardless of who he's playing. And then Julio Jones, you pretty much got to start that guy. And for really the same reasons that Devontae Freeman is, because he's the number 1 wide receiver. And any given week, he can go out and get you 150 yards and 3 touchdowns. So you put him in and just hope that he doesn't have an awful day. One guy I do want to bring up, though, is someone who's really came out of nowhere, and the Falcons actually gave crap to the Browns for releasing him last season, is wide receiver Taylor Gabriel. Now, he hasn't done a ton, but in the last couple weeks, it's worked out. He's one of those small, quick receivers, and if he can get out into space and he can just make something happen. In the last 3 games, he has at least 5 targets, and he has 10 receptions in all 3 of those games. And to match, he has 3 touchdowns. So that is a great reception to touchdown ratio. And, you can't expect a ton out of him, because really what it looks like is that he's getting the majority of his points and touchdowns on long gains. So it's usually the screen pass that they're tossing out to him. So it's again, I'm giving you risky players here this week that if you want to take that risk and try to go for the win, Taylor Gabriel is a really interesting play this week, especially going up against the Chiefs. You can take into all the factors that maybe the Chiefs know that this is happening, and they'll try to defend it as best as they can. But usually when you have speed like that, it is very hard to defend that. So I'm not saying that you go out and start him definitely, but I really think that he's in contention to be in your flex, or at least to go out, sign the guy if he's on your free agent waiver wire, because he could be the number 2 wide receiver on the Falcons, and Matt Ryan can spread the ball around. Next matchup I got for you is an interesting matchup. You have the Rams going to New England to take on the Patriots. And I'll start with the Patriots because they have a ton of injuries. It was just announced this week, Rob Gronkowski having surgery, and he's likely to miss the rest of this season. And he's really a non-factor for the rest of the fantasy season, even if he can come back at some point in the playoffs for the Patriots. So Tom Brady also, he's been listed as questionable and really saying that he's a game-time decision, but more than likely, Brady is going to play this week, and I'd really be shocked if he didn't end up getting on the field. But how is not having Rob Gronkowski going to affect Tom Brady's game? And if you ask me, I really don't think it's going to affect him that much, because he's managed without Rob Gronkowski before. Yeah, he's a great target, and Rob Gronkowski is a freak on the football field, but Tom Brady's going to be able to spread the ball around still. So Tom Brady still going to produce at a high level fantasy-wise. And I think some of the people who are going to benefit are the wide receivers and the running back James White. James White hasn't really done a whole lot the last couple of weeks, and I think he could be a factor in this game, getting some relief for not having Rob Gronkowski. LeGarrette Blount, I think he's still a good play because he's the victory cigar for the New England Patriots. They're going to put him in whenever they have a lead, and LeGarrette Blount is just he's a freight train, and he's hard to stop. The wide receivers on the Patriots, Edelman, he's been listed as questionable, but he's been listed as questionable for pretty much since week 5. So Julian Edelman is going to play this week, and he's been targeted a ton. So I don't really see an uptick in targets for him, but I see an uptick in targets for everybody else who's on the Patriots wide receiver core. And the one guy that I really like, I think Malcolm Mitchell will be the big beneficiary. You got Danny Amendola and Malcolm Mitchell to fight for that number 2 and 3 spot. And Malcolm Mitchell has proven already that he can really be a really good target. And he might be one of their best finds in the draft on offense for the past couple of years. So I like him. I think he's in the flex conversation. I think Danny Amendola also in the flex conversation, and it'd be hard to really find somebody that if you have a bad matchup, you put one of those guys in. On the Rams side, they've just been a mess this year. They with Todd, it's starting with Todd Gurley just not being able to produce. I think he has another bad matchup this week against the New England Patriots. I don't think he's going to do that great. I think he probably doesn't top 100 yards. I mean, he might top 100 yards altogether, but that's not what you're hoping out of a guy that you drafted in the first round in most fantasy football leagues. Jared Goff, the rookie quarterback, he was okay in his first start, but he's not going to win you a football game. So Jared Goff doesn't even really deserve to be owned in most leagues. And then Tavon Austin, the Kenny Britts, neither of them are really, they're just not worth, they're like super high risks. The guys like Tyreek Hill, Taylor Gabriel, those are guys with risk, but you also see the upside. Tavon Austin and Kenny Britt are on an awful offense, and that's pure risk with really no upside. It's really almost, it would be kind of dumb to start one of those guys. So I'm not touching really any of the Los Angeles Rams. Next matchup I got for you, I got the Houston Texans going to Green Bay to take on the Packers. The Houstons, even though they are up at the top of their division, they still just don't look good. I think they're getting it done. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors, and I think their defense is really helping them out. So Brock Osweiler, not a fantasy football quarterback. Lamar Miller has been really the one bright spot on their offense. He's plodding along, and he's getting the most carries that he's ever received in his NFL career. So that does worry me that, maybe he's going to start wearing down at some point. And if you're going into the playoffs and you're riding Lamar Miller, I'd be very, very careful. And I might try to look to see if there's anybody out in the waiver wire who I can put on my bench just in case Lamar Miller has some sort of breakdown. And then DeAndre Hopkins, I think he's at the point where you might be able to actually bench this guy because the Texans, they don't really have much of a passing game. I know it's hard to bench a guy who you probably drafted probably in the second or third round, but this passing game is just really bad, and you probably have somebody on your bench. I think one situation, a guy like Jamison Crowder is. You have a hard. It's when you say Jamison Crowder and DeAndre Hopkins, it's really hard to how do I start Crowder over Hopkins? But I think if you're really trying to get into the fantasy playoffs, this is the week where you maybe want to bench DeAndre Hopkins because they're going into Green Bay. It's going to be a very tough matchup, and I think Brock Osweiler is really going to struggle in this game because the Packers, they are playing at a very high level. And if they want to have any chance of the playoffs, they need to win these games. So it's going to be a tough game for the Texans. On the opposite side with the Packers, Aaron Rodgers, he's listed as questionable. It's really interesting to see two of the top quarterbacks in the league, be questionable in going into these games. But Aaron Rodgers, for all intents and purposes, he should play. Just check to make sure. I would be shocked if Aaron Rodgers didn't get up for this game and play. And I think going up against the Texans, he's not going to have a huge day, but I think he's going to be efficient and he's going to be able to at least give you enough to win this game for them. And the running back situation, James Starks hasn't been that great, but he's an interesting guy. He's maybe a low end running back too. I think he's in the flex conversation, and I like him better in PPR leagues because that's where you get a lot of the points out of him. The wide receivers, it's really been a toss-up. Jordy Nelson has been the guy who's, and even as I started saying that, I was going to say Jordy Nelson has been the guy, but really it's been across the board. It's been one guy each week. Jordy Nelson, Devontae Adams, Randall Cobb, you're never sure who's really going to be the main guy in the week. And I don't think this is the week where Aaron Rodgers is going to go out and throw for 400 yards, throwing 100 yards to each guy and getting a touchdown to each guy. So I think it's really a toss-up. I think Jordy Nelson, pretty much on principle, you have to leave him in your starting lineup as a wide receiver. And then Devontae Adams and Randall Cobb, you put them in at flex, and you're just hoping that they can, get you a long touchdown. And that's the way you got to play with the Packers. I'm going to take a quick break. When I come back, we're going to finish up the rest of this matchups, and then you can get on to Week 13 of Fantasy Football. You're listening to the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerds. Before I get back into the breakdowns of Week 13, I have a special favor to ask for all of our listeners. Our sponsor, the Fan Up Network, their creators, Eric DeWalt, his daughter, Zoe, is a finalist to be the next NFL Play 60 kid, and she could win a trip to the Super Bowl, and it would mean a lot to us here at the Detroit Sports Podcast Network and to the Fan Up family if you could go and vote for her at superkid.nflrush.com. That's superkid.nflrush.com and vote for Zoe. She's the one who's wearing a Carolina Panthers shirt. And now back into the breakdown of Week 13, going into the Buffalo Bills taking on the Oakland Raiders. Now, the Bills aren't that great of a team. They had some prospects in the beginning of the season, but really it's a two-man team, really. And it's Tyrod Taylor, and he's not even a starting quarterback. But he is if you are looking for some bye-week help. I know my wife, she actually had Marcus Mariota. She thought bye week were over, and she needed a quarterback. So she went out, she picked up Tyrod Taylor. It's an interesting matchup. And Tyrod Taylor, you never know. He may give you a decent game. He gives you those rushing points as well. And the other guy who's on that team who's really making any sort of a difference in fantasy is LaShawn McCoy. Shady McCoy, even though he's had some injury problems throughout the year, he still seems to get it done. So I think he's still a dependable starter for fantasy players. On the other side of the ball, the Oakland Raiders really have picked it up this year. Derek Carr has moved himself in. I think he's a top 10 quarterback fantasy-wise, and he's just got a host of people to help him on this team. I think Latavius Murray he could struggle this week going up against a tough Buffalo Bills defense, but I think you still put him in. I think he's a running back too, maybe a flex option. You probably don't have too many better options than Latavius Murray out there. And then the wide receivers, Amari Cooper and Michael Crabtree, are always really good starts in any game, really. Amari Cooper, he's definitely a wide receiver starter. And Michael Crabtree, I think he's a really dependable flex option for most people. Moving on to what could be another high-scoring game this week, you got the New York Giants taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers. They both have the possibility of putting up a ton of points. With the Giants, you got Eli Manning, he's just having one of those seasons where he's kind of defying all odds of what we've seen from Eli Manning, in at least last year, and it's a passing team. So Eli could put up some points against the Steelers. Rashad Jennings has come on as of late, after dealing with some injuries at the beginning of the season. And I don't think he's going to have a huge day, but if you're looking for a dependable running back, I think he's a decent play as a running back too. He could give you some better points than some other running backs who you're not sure if they're going to play, or if you're just not sure if they're going to be able to produce. And then the wide receivers, Odell Beckham Jr., he's always a threat to really go off, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had at least 2 touchdowns in this game. And then, Sterling Shepard, I really like Sterling Shepard, and I think in years to come, he's going to be a really dependable wide receiver. But at this point, you just never know when he's actually going to produce. So if you're going to start him, you got to go with a little bit of risk, and there's a possibility that he gives you nothing, but then there's also the possibility that he at least gets the cleanup from Odell Beckham, and he could get maybe 80 yards and a touchdown, which could be the difference in your fantasy matchups. On the other side of the ball with the Steelers, it really comes down to the big three. You got Big Ben, you got Le'Veon Bell, and Antonio Brown, and those are the guys who are the most dependable on that team. Ben Roethlisberger is going to throw the ball, and more than likely than not, he's going to throw the ball to Antonio Brown. So they're going to put up points together. Antonio Brown, you saw him get 3 touchdowns a week ago. He got all of Ben's touchdown passes. So it kind of just works out that way, where those are really the guys who are the focus of that offense. And I don't think the Giants have enough weapons on defense to shut them down on offense. So, and I didn't even mention Le'Veon Bell. Le'Veon Bell is, slowly, again, he's making a case for being up there in the upper echelon of running backs in the league. So Le'Veon Bell, he's going to put up points this week, and this could be a high-scoring matchup. So I really like all these guys to start for fantasy. Next matchup I got for you, I got the Washington Redskins going to Arizona to take on the Cardinals. The Cardinals have just been a mess this season, and I think it kind of starts with Carson Palmer, and he's really starting to show his age. And I think the Cardinals are probably going to have to find the answer, at least their next quarterback in this upcoming draft. But Carson Palmer, I don't like him in this game. I think he's going to struggle, and I think that's going to hurt all the wide receivers. The last time I told you that I saw this happening and I said to sit pretty much everybody on the Cardinals, I got burned by Larry Fitzgerald. So Larry Fitzgerald, I don't think I'm ever going to tell you to sit him, but I'm not expecting a huge day out of him. But I think he can at least produce some numbers for you. And the one guy in the Cardinals who it doesn't really matter who he's playing, he's the best. He's probably the best running back in the league right now, and that's David Johnson. I think he's going to, even though the Redskins will probably game plan for him, David Johnson is still going to be able to run all over the Washington Redskins. The Redskins, on the other hand, have been looking pretty solid. Kirk Cousins, even though he started off slow in the season, he's really gained some traction, and he's throwing the ball a ton. And he's finding his receivers. He's showing that he is an accurate thrower. So Kirk Cousins, I think he's a top 10 quarterback this week. He's finally broken through, and I think he's a top 10 quarterback this week because I think the Cardinals are a little bit depleted on defense. So Kirk Cousins might be able to expose that. The running back, Robert Kelly, I'm not so sure about him. I think he maybe a low-end running back too. I wouldn't put him in a flex because you probably have other people who can put up bigger numbers who you can put in your flex. But I think a low-end running back too, because even though the Cardinals are a little bit depleted, I think they can still stop the run. And then the wide receivers, you saw last week that Kirk Cousins spread the ball around, and I think you're not going to see that every week where, Deshaun Jackson, Jamison Crowder, and Jordan Reed all have big days. But I think with Jordan Reed, the tight end, he's not going to be playing. It does mean that that's more receptions for the receivers. And I think if anybody, it probably helps Pierre Garçon. So I like Deshaun Jackson, Jamison Crowder, and Pierre Garçon this week to, they can at least get around 80 yards and maybe a touchdown. And I think one of those guys could have a big day. I mean, obviously, you look at Deshaun Jackson because he's the big play guy. He could turn something into nothing at any time in the game. But I'm going to stick with Jamison Crowder. He's the most dependable, really, of those three. Deshaun Jackson can go out and have 120 yards, but Jamison Crowder, every week he seems to be getting, between 6 and 8 catches and around 80 yards and maybe a touchdown. So, but I like all three of those guys because no Jordan Reed, and I think they're going to be passing in this game because they have to make up ground if they want to make it into the playoffs as well. And the last matchup I got for you this week is the Sunday Night Football game, and it's probably one of the biggest matchups of the year. You get the Carolina Panthers traveling to Seattle to take on the Seahawks. It's a matchup. It's a rematch of the playoffs last year where the Panthers beat the Seahawks. And really, they've been going at it all week, really, over the media. And I think it's going to be a really fun game to watch. It could be a really hard-nosed match to watch, too, because it may just be a defensive battle back and forth. So I would put a little bit of caution on starting any of these players because this could be one of those defensive battles. You already saw the Seahawks got in a tie game this year because it was just a big defensive battle. But I think because the Panthers, they are struggling this year, I think the Seahawks are going to be able to outgain the Panthers in this game. But for fantasy, Cam Newton, I think this is going to be a very tough matchup for him. And as we've seen throughout the year, he's been getting hit a ton. I expect the Seahawks to come after Cam Newton, and Cam Newton's going to be on his back. So unless he can overcome that, it's going to be a rough day for Superman. So Cam Newton, I think he's going to have a less than average day. You might actually see him throw a couple picks in this game. And then the running back, Jonathan Stewart, it's just going to be tough sledding going up against the Seattle Seahawks. And it doesn't spell good things for the wide receivers, Kelvin Benjamin, Devin Funchess. If you can, I would leave Benjamin on your bench this week, going up against that tough Seattle secondary. And the only guy who I think has any merit starting this week would be Greg Olsen, the tight end for the Panthers. It's just because he's going to be the one guy that gets left behind or kind of left outside. So Greg Olsen could still put up some numbers this week. On the opposite side of the ball, with the Seattle Seahawks, I think the Seahawks want a little bit of revenge for last year, and I think they're a little salty. And we could see a big day this week from Russell Wilson. And I think he's gonna do everything in his power to really stick it to the Panthers. And Pete Carroll likes to hold grudges. So I like Russell Wilson this week. I think he's probably a top 10 quarterback. And then at running back, Thomas Rawls, if he can stay healthy, he's a pretty solid running back. But it's that question is he actually fully healthy, and is he running at 100%? I think he's a low end running back too, and maybe in the flex conversation in a lot of fantasy leagues. And then Doug Baldwin, I think if Russell Wilson's going to have a big day, I think Doug Baldwin is going to be the main guy. Last year, he had to go up against Josh Norman, but as we've seen this year, with no Josh Norman, the Panthers have pretty much been neutered, and they've been having a tough time on defense. So I like Doug Baldwin to have a pretty solid game. And then I think Jimmy Graham, I think he's going to put up some numbers too. The Seahawks want to beat the Panthers this week, and they have a little bit more incentive. So I like the Seahawks this week. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Fantasy Nerds, Week 13. I wish you all luck. Hopefully next week you can be happy about being in the playoffs, or I can console you and you'll probably be playing for the toilet bowl. Until next week, later, nerds.